So have you ever wondered what makes highly intelligent people tick? For decades, a lot of researchers thought they had a shortcut to the answer. Just study people in MENSA. I mean, it seems perfect, right? But what if that shortcut actually leads us completely down the wrong path? Well, we're going to dive into a fascinating paper that pulls the rug out from under that very idea.
Think about it for a second. If you want to study the smartest folks out there, finding a group that's already pre-screened, a group that's already passed the test, seems like a total no-brainer. And that's MENSA. It feels like the most logical place to start. But as we're about to see, what seems logical isn't always good science.
And look, this isn't a new thing. Researchers have been doing this for decades. Since way back in 1968, MENSA has been the go-to sample population for studying high IQ. You can see why. It's easy, it's cheap, but it just might be completely wrong.
Okay, so to really figure out if this is a valid approach, let's just look at the numbers. Let's see who's actually in MENSA. Because this is where that simple, logical idea really starts to fall apart. The statistics tell a very, very surprising story. All right, first, the basics. MENSA's entire brand is built on exclusivity. To get that membership card, you have to score in the top 2% on a standardized intelligence test. Now, what that means is that 1 out of every 50 people you meet could, in theory, be a member. That's the entire pool of people we're talking about. But here is the first massive crack in the logic. In the United States, out of all the people who are smart enough to join MENSA, less than 1% actually do. Let that sink in. Over 99% of the most intelligent Americans take a look at MENSA and effectively say, "Nah, I'm good." That is a huge red flag for any researcher.
And if you think that's wild, hold on. Because globally, the number is even more staggering. It drops to just 0.09%. That's practically zero. So the group that researchers are studying, these people who are both eligible and choose to join, is just a tiny, self-selected sliver of the actual high IQ population.
So this begs the obvious question. Why? Why on earth don't the world's smartest people want to join the world's most famous smart person club? Well, before we get all academic, the internet, as always, has some pretty sharp and witty theories. Here's a great take from the writer Peter Johnson. Yeah, it's a bit of a zinger for sure, but it points to a very real social cost. Maybe joining just isn't seen as a cool move, and, being aware of that social dynamic is in itself a kind of intelligence.
And author John Scalzi puts it even more bluntly. He's basically saying the real 4D chess move is to not play the game at all. The very act of needing a membership card to prove you're smart might just suggest you're not as confident as you seem. And this idea, it leads us perfectly into a really cool concept from game theory. So believe it or not, all these witty, kind of sarcastic comments actually point to a really solid theory from economics and game theory. It gives us this powerful framework for understanding why people do this, and it all comes down to 2 ideas: signaling and counter-signaling.
Okay, so signaling is pretty straightforward. It's basically an action you take to prove you have some hidden quality. You can't see someone's bank account, so they buy a Ferrari to signal wealth. You can't see intelligence, so you might get a MENSA certificate to signal you're smart. It's all about making the invisible visible.
But then you have counter-signaling, and this is the real power move. This is when you're so secure in your status, so confident in your quality, that you don't need the flashy signal. Intentionally avoiding the signal becomes its own, more subtle, and often more powerful signal to the people who are in the know. And the paper we're looking at uses the perfect analogy to explain this. Think about the nouveau riche, or new money. They might flaunt their wealth with giant logos and flashy cars. That's signaling. Now think about old money, who might choose understated, quiet luxury. That's counter-signaling. The theory here suggests that MENSA members are kind of like the nouveau riche of intellect, while the 99% of high IQ people who don't join, they're the old money, so confident they just don't need the label.
So, why does any of this matter? This isn't just some fun thought experiment. This is where it gets really serious. Because using a sample of signalers to draw conclusions about all smart people can create and reinforce some really harmful stereotypes, like the classic mad professor myth.
So check this out. In 2018, a study came out, and the researchers surveyed MENSA members. They reached this really dramatic conclusion. Highly intelligent people are at a much greater risk for things like psychological disorders. It sounds groundbreaking, maybe even a little scary. But the key question is, who are they actually talking to?
Their conclusion wasn't really about highly intelligent people at all.
It was about the tiny fraction of a fraction, the 0.83% of eligible Americans who choose to join MENSA, and then an even smaller group who decided to respond to their survey. I mean, this is sampling bias 101. The group they studied just doesn't represent the whole.
So the author of our source paper, Katil Haugen, rewrote their conclusion to be, well, more accurate. And just look at the difference. It's painfully precise, it's correct, and it's also not nearly as catchy a headline, which is exactly the point. The real finding is about a very specific, very small group of people, not all smart people.
And this is how these myths get cemented in our culture. This flawed research gets picked up by media outlets, and they simplify it even more. A Norwegian research site, for instance, ran this headline, which just flatly states that a study confirms the connection. And just like that, a cautious, flawed finding about a tiny subgroup gets transformed into a confirmed fact about all smart people.
Okay, so after all of this, the numbers, the social dynamics, the game theory, the very real-world consequences, we come all the way back to our original question. Can researchers confidently use MENSA members to stand in for the entire high IQ population?
The author's conclusion is blunt, and it's unambiguous. The answer is a crystal clear no. The group of people that chooses to join MENSA is just fundamentally different from the 99% of eligible people who don't, and that makes it a poor and potentially very misleading proxy for research.
So what are the big lessons here? What should you take away from all this? First, and most importantly, MENSA members are simply not representative of all people with high IQs. It's a classic case of sampling bias. Second, the very act of signaling by joining means that members might have fundamentally different traits than the vast majority who don't. And finally, it all goes to show that when you're doing research on sensitive topics like intelligence, you have to be incredibly careful.
And that leaves us with one last thought. We've just taken apart one obvious research shortcut. It really makes you wonder, what other common sense truths, in science or even just in our daily lives, might completely fall apart if we just took a closer look? Thanks for joining this explainer.